Hello and welcome to another TLDR EU video. If someone were to ask you to name two big aircraft manufacturers, you'd probably come up with Boeing and Airbus. Together, the two companies have an immense market share, with airlines turning to them time after time after time. In other words, they're a duopoly. But this isn't like any ordinary duopoly. Airbus and Boeing are ultimately backed heavily by national governments. Boeing is a proudly American firm, and Airbus a proudly European one, which has invariably meant that disputes between the two are prone to arise. Well, we say disputes, but it's actually been one single dispute that's 17 years in the making. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why this dispute has been running for so long, what's changed in recent days, and what the future could hold for the EU-US jet war. Let's rewind and try and explain how we got to this point. Before the dispute even began, in 1992, the US and EU had a bilateral agreement in place to allow for governmental support when it came to large civil aircraft. Under the terms of the agreement, Airbus will be allowed to receive up to a third of its development costs as a loan, with Boeing permitted to receive direct grants up to the value of 3% of the American civil aviation industry turnover. An agreement. So far so good, right? In 2004, however, Airbus began to become a much bigger force in the aircraft industry, with deliveries beginning to overtake its American rival. Seeing such astronomical growth, Boeing asked the US to withdraw from the agreement and file a complaint with the World Trade Organization. And that's because both Boeing and the United States argued that Airbus, or more specifically the countries hosting Airbus, back then the UK, France, Germany and Spain, were in breach of the World Trade Organization's rules on subsidies, due to the support that Airbus was receiving from the countries. The US claimed that some $22 billion of illegal subsidies had been dispensed to Airbus, resulting in an economic benefit to the tune of $200 billion. The EU, on behalf of the host countries, and not wanting to be outdone, on the very same day launched a counterclaim, challenging $23 billion of support given to Boeing. The EU alleged that through both state tax breaks and de facto state aid through large defense contracts given to it by the US, they were breaking WTO rules to the tune of $23 billion US. It took several years for the WTO to delve into the case, before a panel and then appellate body both found in 2011 that the loans provided by the host countries were not prohibited under WTO rules, and would only count as a subsidy if they were offered more favourable terms than what was offered on the private market when it came to interest rates. The WTO did, however, rule that some aspects of the support were actionable. In turn, the WTO ordered the EU to withdraw the remaining subsidies or remove the effects of the subsidies. Some moves were made by the EU side to comply with the rulings, but the US formally requested that they be given leave to apply countermeasures due to non-compliance in certain areas. The WTO agreed to Boeing's request, permitting the US to levy some $7.5 billion of tariffs on an annual basis. When it came to the EU and Airbus's counterclaim, the WTO agreed that the 787 would not have been possible in the absence of illegal subsidies, and that the situation risked putting Airbus at a significant disadvantage. Again, the WTO ordered Boeing and the US to rectify the situation, either by withdrawing the subsidies or by removing the effect of them. And yet again, countermeasures were requested, this time by the EU. Countermeasures which again were granted. The EU would therefore be permitted to levy $4 billion worth of tariffs on US goods each year, causing the longest ever trade dispute to be heard by the WTO to turn into a tit-for-tat trade war. Until now, that is. In recent days, the EU and US have finally come to an agreement. Okay, well, maybe not an agreement, but a truce. Both sides will remove the tariffs imposed due to the dispute, covering the likes of wine, sugarcane, cheese, and tractors for the next 5 years. This move is widely seen as a more docile approach from the US and the Biden administration, with the president remarking that I think we have great opportunities to work closely with the EU as well as NATO, and I feel quite good about it. It goes without saying that trying to cooperate and embark on these great opportunities, while a literal trade war goes on in the background, wouldn't have been the easiest thing to do. In a bid to make the truce a permanent agreement, a ministerial-level EU-US joint working group is to be established to try and find an amicable framework. The EU's Trade Commissioner stressed that the agreement would ground the dispute, allowing for time and space to find a lasting solution. In conversation with the Financial Times, the Commissioner went further, stating that he was confident that at the end of the day, we'll be able to put this dispute to rest completely. Although the US trade representative did say that tariffs would be re-implemented if US companies became unable to compete fairly with European ones. So why the sudden shift in attitude? Well, there's two reasons: the pandemic and China. On the pandemic front, this agreement comes at a pivotal time for both Airbus and Boeing. With most countries heavily locking down, international passenger numbers have fallen off a cliff in recent months. Take Heathrow. In April 2017, 6.7 million passengers came through its doors. In 2018, it was 6.5, 2019, 6.8, and in 2020, just 206,000 people, just 3% of the previous years. And this is a picture repeated all around the world. Although passengers weren't going anywhere, and furlough schemes did cover some of the costs, airlines had to pay for the likes of maintenance and rental costs, all of which have been eating away at their reserve capital, meaning that airlines were less than likely to want to stump up capital for a new aircraft. This led many airlines to cancel or defer orders they already placed with Airbus and Boeing, something which hit the manufacturers quite badly. In February of 2020, Airbus's stock price stood close to €140 per share, but by the end of March, that figure was just €49. A very similar picture develops when we look at Boeing. In February, touching $340 a share, but by mid-March, just $95. When it comes to China, while both Airbus and Boeing are currently the two biggest aircraft manufacturers, they're facing a very real threat to their market dominance. The creatively named Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China is in the very final stages of producing the C919, an aircraft expected to enter service later this year, and one widely seen as a direct competitor to some of the most ubiquitous aircraft from the duopoly, the Airbus A320 and the Boeing 737 MAX. In fact, in the aftermath of the agreement, Biden released a statement and mentioned China directly, explaining that the US and EU had agreed to work together to counter and challenge China's non-market practices in this sector that give China's companies an unfair advantage, saying that the US and EU will work together in specific ways that reflect our high standards. It's a model we can build on for other challenges posed by China's economic model. Boeing themselves, in their commercial market outlook, remark that China will become the world's largest aviation market, highlighting that in the past decade, a quarter of all aviation growth has come from China. So it's not surprising that these allied nations might choose to halt their war in order to take on the outsider. But what do you think? Is this truce just a sticking plaster? Or is the threat from China and COVID enough to force them to find a proper solution in the next 5 years? As always, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.